This is the Napoleonic Wars by GMT. Actually, this is the cyberboard version because I found it easier to record my screen than to film the physical board. But the cyberboard game box is the map and the pieces look pretty much exactly like they do in the actual board. I'll be introducing the major rules of play and some of the minor ones. I won't quite cover every single one, as well as a few strategy tips and other general bits of info about the game. We'll start with the map here, which is point to point on land, and at sea there are these areas rather than points. Several other games, Here I Stand, Fury of Dracula, use such a mechanism. All the land spaces in this game are duchies. The circular ones here, those are just duchies. The square duchies are keys, and they count as victory points. Obviously, the star and the capital letters are capital cities. These 8-pointed stars here are fortresses. Note there's a 2 by them here, Grodno, Königsberg, Copenhagen. There is one and only one 4 on the board, and that is Gibraltar. Every other fortress is a 2. The fortresses are also keys. Keys are victory points and card draws in this. This is a card-driven game. So we'll get into the victory points there and how you win before I go to the rest of the map. You get 1 point for every key that you control above what you started with, and you lose 1 for every key you lose from your starting inventory. So with the magic of pausing, we'll jump over here to the control chart and place everyone's key markers at their start. France controls 13 keys, and of the playable sides, France, Austria, Britain, Russia, and Prussia. Prussia's down here with only 6, but France doesn't start ahead in victory points because of that. If France took 1 from Prussia, France would move up to 14 and Prussia would move down. That would be 1 victory point for France, and now Prussia is at -1. I'll go ahead and move those back. So it is an advantage to have more keys because you draw a card for every 2 keys that you have, but you don't get an advantage of points just by starting with more keys. You start better, but you have to earn it to go up in victory points from there. The other 2 ways to get victory points are resources. There's a chart here. Again, one of each of the major 5 powers has one. The minor powers of Denmark, Sweden, Spain, and the Ottoman Turks do not start with a resource. Also, if playing with fewer than 5 players, there will be fewer resources because you start with 1 per player, not 1 per power. With 5 players, that is 1 per power. But if you're playing 2 players, the coalition player representing Austria, Russia, and Britain has to choose. I've got 1 resource, which of my side gets it. I'll mostly be introducing 5-player rules here, but I will mention when I can the cases where the rules are slightly different for fewer players. These resources are another source of victory points. So actually here we see 1 victory point for each side because each side has 1 resource. You can turn them in for cards later. The question is, do I want to lose that victory point to draw a card? Could 1 card gain me more than that 1 victory point back? Maybe, maybe not. Also over here are tracks for the minor countries. Actually, since this is 5 players, Prussia is a major country, so it does not go on this diplomacy chart here. I'll put Prussia down there and explain that in a second. Here is Spain, which starts at a pact with France. That is a victory point for France. Each of these 4 minor sides, if you get them all the way to pact, which is a full alliance with them, that's a victory point. So those are the sources of victory points. Gaining keys, losing keys, resources, and a pact with a minor ally. At the end of the game, which could happen at any of the 5 turns, whichever nation has the most victory points will win the game. If there's a tie, there is this movement track here. Let me get the pieces off the board for just a second. It's broken in reverse order. So Prussia wins any ties with anyone. Russia wins ties with anyone but Prussia, etc. France loses ties with anyone. So as France, you have to have more victory points than anyone to win the game. With Prussia, all you have to do is at least match everyone. Incidentally, this means there are no ties in the game. Someone will win and the other 4 players will lose the game. It doesn't matter who is on your team, which are called camps in this game. You win or lose as an individual nation. Speaking of the teams, I'll put the back on the board. France starts in the Imperial camp. They cannot leave. Britain is in the coalition camp. They cannot leave. Britain and France are always in opposition. And you must be in one camp or another to fight. You are with Napoleon or you are against him. There is no middle ground. Austria and Russia start in the coalition, but they can change. It's not usually wise, but occasionally it is. Prussia starts neutral, and they can choose which side to join. Other than Prussia at the start of the game, there isn't a way to be neutral other than to submit to someone, meaning either they forcibly conquered you or they invaded your territory and you decided to make a deal to surrender for a time. So you don't want to be neutral. Even if you don't want to, you got to pick one side or another. Usually, because France is much more powerful than everyone, you want to be against them or they'll win, but not always. Back to the map, there are different connections between spaces. These ones here, all coming in and out of Berlin, for example, those are roads. You have rough connections here, that's the brown line. Mountain passes are the dashed line. Swamps are these blue lines here. These are the only 3 swamp connections in the game. And then there are a few places, such as connecting Copenhagen on either side. These are straits. They affect defenders in battle. If the opposing attacker comes across anything except a clear road, you get some extra battle dice. Also, there are times when attackers may take attrition for moving across unfriendly passes, retreating across them. They affect interception before a battle or evading from a battle in different ways, some of which I'll get into later, some of which are minutiae for the reference charts. Incidentally, unlike a fair amount of other games, they don't affect your movement points directly. A force can move across a clear terrain or a swamp for the same number of operations points. And then we'll take a quick look at the forces that are moving. They come in 1s, 2s, or 4s, which are men, cavalry, and cannons, but that doesn't really affect anything. There's a national leader. The number at the top is the amount of extra battle dice the leader grants to his force, and the number below is the amount of combat units, or CUs, a lot of times we just call them troops, that he can carry. And here are some squadrons. The top number is the amount of dice the squadron rolls in battle. The sails there, it may be a little hard to read, but that's a +2 on the British and a +1 on the French sails, and it's 0 for everyone else. Are its modifier to find enemy squadrons or evade being found by enemy squadrons. I'll go ahead and rehide those and go back onto the squares. Notice some of them are solid and some are dual colored. A solid colored duchy is a home duchy. A dual colored duchy is an associate duchy. Associates start the game belonging to the side on the bottom. So Munich, Zurich, Milan, these are all French associates. They grant cards to the French. If someone else takes them over, that's a victory point loss for France and a victory point gain for that other side. A few of these dual colors have something other than white on the top. It's a dual associate of 2 sides. Notice the Low Countries here are French associates. They start the game with France, but they're also British associates. And then one weakness of Prussia is 2 of their keys, Hanover and Warsaw here, are also French and British associates. So no matter which team Prussia joins, they have a key that is an associate of one of their primary, if not their singular, enemy. And the associates generally represent some sort of minor alliance here. Belgium, I believe, was allied with Britain. The Warsaw has the associate with France because Napoleon took advantage of tensions to raise Polish troops who didn't tend to like the surrounding nations who had gobbled them up, and so the Poles tended to favor France. Britain has alliance with, I believe, the Kingdom of Naples, that sort of thing. You can build your troops in a home or associate duchy. They're equal for building troops. However, sometimes there's this regroup box down here, and there are 5 or 6 different cards of the 100 or so in the game that can send troops to regroup. So some games you'll see big forces there, and sometimes the box never gets used all game. When you are regrouping troops, they're cheaper, but they must come in a home duchy, not an associate. Also, when you conquer someone, you generally have to give their home keys back, although some of them may be ceded to you in the treaty. But you don't have to give the associates back because you haven't gotten into that nation's integral territory. You've just conquered some allies, and they kind of the kings and nobles don't care so much about the allies. All right, so let's look at the military forces a bit as some of them magically appear on the board. Unlike a lot of games, the leader isn't just the leader and his staff. The leader represents support troops, reserve artillery, that sort of thing. So they actually count as fighting formations in themselves under some circumstances. So here we have Bagration with 4 troops and Davout with 2. Let's say these 2 troops were somewhere else for a second. This probably wouldn't be wise, but Davout could come out here as if he were a unit by himself, move in to enemy territory and start some fights. Again, probably not wise, but possible, and sometimes you get reduced to just a leader, and the fact that they still count as an army unit is important. In fact, any stack with a leader, even if that stack is just the leader, actually counts as an army in this game, as long as the leader can carry all the troops. So Davout here is an army, just him, because again, it's not just the man, it's the man and the core artillery, the reserve cavalry, whatever else is there. Davout with 6 units is an army here. Davout with 8 units, that is not an army. Davout and 6 of those 8 are the army, and the other 2 are just 2 units by themselves. 6 units by themselves without a leader, also not an army. That's important because of interceptions and evasions and flag placement. Flags being how you indicate control of a duchy that isn't hard-coded to you. So Bagration and his 4 troops here, on their own turn, could move to Prague, and then cross to Ratisbon, and then come in here to Württemberg, and those 6 units in, I believe, what is that, Munich, could do nothing about it because there's no leader there. Now with Davout back in the space, if Bagration and his 4 tried to move to Ratisbon, the French player could choose to attempt to intercept. You would roll 2 dice, try to get a 9. You get to add the battle rating of the leader here, so now you're only trying to get a 6 essentially. And there are sometimes negative modifiers if you don't control the space you're in, or if you're going across a pass, and a few other things like that. And then also in this instant, let's say Davout fails to intercept or doesn't try, Bagration could now place a Russian flag in that French space. And now it's a Russian space. They couldn't build there, but they control it, which is important for a few different reasons. They could also place a flag here because it's adjacent to a leader. However, they couldn't place a flag here because it's also adjacent to the enemy leader who can theoretically intercept into that space. There are some situations where the leader doesn't block the adjacent space. Don't worry about that now. The point is you generally don't want your stacks of troops to not have leaders. Now I'll reset some pieces again. There's a really important concept with armies called army groups. Bagration here can only carry 6 troops with him in his own army. However, if there's another leader there with additional troops, there we go. Space is running a little bit out because I want you all to be able to see it, but they're all in the same space for purposes of this. Bagration could carry his 6 units, plus Tormasov could carry 4, and they could move together as one army group with Bagration and Tormasov and their combined rating of 10. And for what it's worth, the official term there is command rating. Bagration 6, Tormasov 4. These other 2 Russian troops could not move along as a third army in the army group because remember, there is no leader. So they're not an army, and only armies can be part of army groups. You would need a third leader for that, or instead of Tormasov, how about Kutuzov? Now you have a combined command rating of 12. Now, to move an army group like this will cost you an extra op for every army in the group. So if you have a huge army piled together, it's going to be pretty cost inefficient to move it, and your enemy can much more cost efficiently just go around you. Now, in this game, you can have minor sides who are allied with you. They could also join your army group like this. Now, there are Danish allies of the Russians. This is a valid army group. 2 armies, it would take 2 ops, technically CP for command points. I'll probably call them both. They could move together as an army group. And now Davout here with his 2 troops couldn't try and intercept this Danish army separately if they're moving together with the Russians like this. Now, if the miners are a pact with your side directly, there's something else fun you can do. This is a valid army. Bagration can carry his own troops plus his pacted minor ally troops together. The reverse is not true. The Danes being minors, a Danish leader couldn't carry Russian troops like this. You could even carry leaders like that. Bagration, with his command of 6, could carry these other 6 units, 4 of his own, 1 of the Danes, plus the leader of the Danes, all as part of his own army, and you can flip the pieces over, equals 1 unit if not in command. Again, leaders are still combat units as well as leaders, so there we go. All of these 6 are under Bagration. Now, if there was a 7th, like this, he can't carry 7 of them, so he would either have to leave 1 of them behind, or we could promote him to his own leader. Now this is an army group, just a pretty inefficient army group because there's 4 additional troops, 1 Russian and 3 Danish. You could fit in here, so you're bringing along not a lot of extra firepower and now spending 2 points instead of 1 every time you try and move somewhere. And now, as I think I said before, but probably not clearly, this only works if it's your own pact ally. For example, if Russia and Austria are allied, as they start the game, and sometimes are that way the entire game, let's say that Austria got a pact with the Danes instead. Now, because it's not Russia's direct pact, Russia could not move together in 1 army. They would have to move together in 2 armies. Now let's talk about combat. This is what's called a buckets of dice system. Large battles tend to have lots and lots of dice rolled. The number of dice each side gets works like this: 1 for each combat unit, whatever the rating of the leader of that army or army group is, plus national bonuses. The national bonus is 2 for the French, 1 for each of the other 4 majors, and nothing for the 4 minors. And then there are terrain effects. So this example here, let's say the Russians attack the French from Linz to Munich across this rough pass. The French would get 7 dice, 2 for their 2 troops, 3 for Davout having a battle rating of 3, plus 2 more for the French national bonus. Then Bagration would get his 2 dice. Russians get 1 for their leader bonus, and then they get 4 for the troops. So this is 7 on 7, except they're crossing rough terrain, so in the first round of battle only, it's 7 on 8, and the French get an extra dice. If the battle goes on to a second round, they no longer get that dice. Thematically, you can think of at that point the attacker has crossed the difficult terrain and is in the space. Note that mountain passes actually give you a +2 in the first round. Swamps, technically marshes, when they are crossed, they give you a +3 dice to the defender in the first round. That's pretty rare. Also, crossing a strait, which is another fairly rare occurrence, gives the defender either 2 or 4 dice, depending on if you're crossing into a regular duchy, key or not, or if you're crossing into a fortress, where it's 4 dice. And then finally, enemy evasions that fail grant you a +1. So if Davout for some reason didn't fight this battle, the odds are pretty good, but let's say he's got fewer troops, he doesn't want to risk it, decides to evade. Just like with interceptions, you roll 2 dice, you try and get a 9. He adds 3. There are some other modifiers. He could try and move back out of this combat. If he fails, though, the opponent gets an extra die, so now it's 8 on 8 again. Actually, no, it's 8 on 7. If you fail an evasion, then you do not get the terrain bonus anymore. So in this case, you probably wouldn't evade with Davout here. You would probably stand and fight as the French. But you could attempt evasion. And then if you had a friendly force in an adjacent duchy, such as Ney here, who remember is a unit all by himself, could attempt to intercept into Munich, would roll the dice, and if successful, now he joins this battle. Remember, he's not in command, so he flips. Davout does not flip. I just want him to move up to the front. So now the French here have an extra dice because they have 3 military units under Davout now instead of 2, since Ney came in with his other reserve corps formations, that sort of thing. So that's how you get the number of dice you roll. How do you actually fight, inflict losses, and win? Well, first you roll the dice, then you see how many 6s and 5s you get. 6s are kills, 5s are disrupts. Kills plus disrupts equals casualties. The side inflicting the more casualties wins the battle. If it's a tie, it goes to a second round, minus all the casualties no longer roll their dice. If the second round is a tie again, if it would go to a third round, there is no third round, the battle is over. And in that instance, the attacker, the active side, would retreat back to where they came from. For what it's worth, technically, that is not considered a victory. It just says if it's tied after 2 rounds, the active formation has to retreat. And it does matter. There are certain cards that you could play in reaction to someone winning or losing a battle. There is no winner or loser in that case. It's tied. And then after the battle, in addition to retreating, you take losses for all the enemy kills, but not the enemy disrupts. So again, in this example we had here, there was 7 Russian dice, 4, 5, 6 for Bagration, and 1 more for the Russian national bonus, 7, then 2, 3, 4, 5 for the leader, 6, 7 for being French, and 1 for the attacker crossing the pass, 7 on 8. Let's say that the French roll 3 5s, but don't roll any 6s. So that's 3 disrupts, 3 casualties. The Russians roll 2 6s, but no other 5s. So the French won 3 casualties to 2, and the Russians, who are technically moving into Munich here to fight, then have to move back where they came from. They've lost the battle. Any cards that can make things worse for you if you lose a battle could come into effect. But they don't suffer any kills because no kills were rolled. The French do suffer the losses, and now they're just left with this, so it may have been a bit of a Pyrrhic victory for them there. That does happen at times in this game, just like it sometimes did in history. It's not usually as ridiculous as my example there, where a force just lost 2/3 of its cohesion, but won the battle while the enemy took no permanent losses. But that sort of thing happens. I've seen weirder than that. And then also let me note, as I pull this 2 back onto the map for illustrative purposes here for a second, your kills do take precedence over the disrupts. So if the Russians got a really great roll with 3 kills and 2 disrupts, the French can say, I'll take the 2 disrupts first, then suffer the 1 kill. Oh, your other kills have no one to kill. No, the 3 disrupts would kill all 3 French units. Also interesting to note, if you get more kills than there are enemies, you get what's called a flag overrun, which is different than an overrun, and you get to flag the space for free. So the Russians come into Munich, they roll 4 kills. It has to be more than your enemy can take, not just enough. It not only wipes out the entire French stack, but the Russians get a flag in Munich, thus controlling the area for a regular overrun is actually a little easier. That just means there are no enemies left through whatever means, and you can keep moving. Otherwise, after you win a battle, you have to stop moving, although you can spend an extra op to place a flag in the space you're at. One other really important concept in battle, let's look at this one. The French now have on defense 6 troops, 7, 8, 9 for the leader, 10, 11 for the French bonus, 12 in the first round only because of the pass. The coalition here has 8 for the units, then a 9th one for the subordinate leader, not because he's a 1, but because he's a subordinate in the army group. All subordinates are worth 1. So that's 9, 10, 11 for the commander's rating, 12 for the Russian/Austrian national bonus. And the dice are rolled. There's a certain number of casualties for each side. Normally, as I said before, you take losses from the kills, but all the disrupts do is help you win the battle. However, if you inflict at least 3 more casualties than your opponent, you have routed them. Routing means all of the disrupts you rolled suddenly become kills. So in this battle, if the French win 7-5 in total casualties, they each take their kills, the coalition moves back. If instead they win 8-5, all 8 will be losses for the coalition. Whether they were all 6s, all 5s, or anything in between, it doesn't matter. Also, you get to roll to get an extra resource for looting the baggage train. The better leader you routed, the better your odds. You roll a d6, and if you roll the leader's rating or lower, you get a resource. So France gets the rout, rolls a 1 or 2 against the leader rating here. Oh look, France now has a second resource, which remember means an extra victory point for them. and they can also turn that in for a card later. Good time here to segue into a couple of relevant topics. Control and attrition. If a space on the board is hard-coded to you, and there's no enemy flag in it, you control the space. That includes being on the bottom half of the associates. So Prussia controls Hanover, France controls Brussels, the Ardennes, etc. If you place a flag in a space, you now control it. There we go. Venice is now a French-controlled space. Army units do not control spaces. So move that. Davout and his army are down here. They move into Venice. France does not control Venice. Austria still sort of does, but there's enemy formations there. Also an important terminology to note, flags are not formations, but they are forces. So here's French formations here and French forces here, but the flag is only a force, not a formation. This is considered an uncontrolled duchy because one side has the flag in it, but the other side has troops in it. Once France places a flag, now it's just French controlled. Control is really important in attrition because when you move from an uncontrolled space to an enemy space, you suffer attrition. So if these forces place a flag, move it to the back here, and then they move their forces forward into the next space, they're fine. They moved from a space they controlled into enemy territory. Now let's say they don't place a flag and they just move on like this. They have now moved from a space they didn't control into a space that the enemy controlled. Now you stop and you roll attrition. Attrition, by the way, that comes right before a battle, are not considered battle casualties for who winning, but they will reduce the number of dice your force fights with. Attrition is simple. You roll a die for every single force you have in the space, or possibly formation, depending on the circumstances. Sometimes flags actually do roll for attrition. In this situation, there are no French flags. There's just the units and the leaders. You roll one dice for each one you've got. That would be 7 in the French case, because again, leaders count 2. They roll 7 dice. Every 6, they suffer a kill just to stragglers, partisans, lack of forage, whatever you might want to consider it as being. However, they're French, so they get to cut their attrition in half. No one else does. So if France rolled 1 6, they would lose 1 guy. If they rolled 2 6s, they would still just lose 1. If they rolled 3 6s, now they'd lose 2. Because the fractions are rounded up for that. In all other cases, by the way, in this game, when you end up with a fraction, you round it in favor of whoever played the card, or whatever active situation they're in. It gets to favor them. The exceptions are if the French unit is in a home, not associate, of Spain, the Turks, or, of course, Russia, their attrition is not halved. I think the issue is generally the French had better organization of their supply lines and logistics, thus they have the attrition, but you get deep enough into Russia and that doesn't happen, or deep enough into Spain or Turkey. And each of these movements that the French force is doing here costs them 1 command point, CP, op. It gets called all of those. Technically, they're CPs again, but the cards in this game run the gamut from 2 to 6 CP, and they all have an event also. It's a pretty standard card-driven game where when you play on your turn, or on your impulse, technically, you choose the event or you choose the ops. You usually don't get both. Moving a force costs 1. Placing a flag also costs 1. You can place a flag where you are if there are no enemy units there. You can also place adjacent to you if you're a leader and you're not placing adjacent to an enemy leader who could intercept you into that space, hypothetically. They don't actually intercept the flag, they just keep it from being placed. If there's no leader, you can only place where you are. Also, after a leader has lost a battle, they cannot place flags anymore, that impulse. It costs 1 to move, even if you're crossing passes or swamps. If you have an army group, it costs 1 per army, so this Austrian force here would take 2 to move. You can also spend your ops on building troops. Building a unit in your home or associate costs you 2 command points. If you have any units in regroup, here we go, you can build them for 1 each, but remember they'd have to be built in your home, not associate. So sometimes you want to leave them there as a reserve that you can build cheaply at the front, but sometimes the front line is your associates and you can't get them out of regroup there. Also, you can build a leader. Even leaders who are Davout gets killed in battle. He's not really killed. His unit is lost. He's dispersed. He's out of the game. You can build him back for his command rating. So it costs you 6 CP, equal to the biggest card in the game, to build him back. Napoleon here. I can't believe I've gone this long into a video without showing the Napoleon piece. There we go, the best leader in the game. One of only 2 leaders with a battle rating of 4. The only leader with a command rating of 8 units. So if the Napoleon piece is ever eliminated, Napoleon himself is not dead, but it takes 8 command points, greater than the value of a card, to get Napoleon back. A little detour there to explain the command points on the cards, mostly which are used for moving and building, or diplomacy, which we'll get to. But as far as movement goes, it's also worth noting that there are other ways to take attrition, such as crossing a mountain pass into enemy territory, or having to retreat across a mountain pass. So if you're retreating across a mountain pass into enemy territory, the sources of attrition will stack, and you'll have to keep rolling each time and potentially take humongous losses. So basically, don't cross over a pass into enemy land if you haven't secured your own land behind you. So if there's no resistance, Napoleon and his forces here don't have to place flags. They could just keep moving, rolling for attrition. Okay, maybe I lost one guy here. You know, I'm the French. I don't take a lot of losses. Oh, let me try again. I didn't lose anyone that time. But as soon as you have to fight and lose, it could potentially get really bad for you retreating across passes or retreating into enemy territory. So you generally don't want to be rolling a lot of attrition. I've seen people make spectacular moves behind enemy lines at times, but you're taking a big risk there. And then, of course, this Napoleon move there actually could have been intercepted by this. You can attempt to intercept as an army group. Now, this is the second edition of the game. The third edition is under development. The rules for who is in charge they seem more complicated than they are, but what is done most of the time in practice, and what I think the third edition will decide, is that you just, in the moment, you can always just say whichever guy is in charge is in charge. So Bagration here, okay, he's in charge, he'll intercept with this entire group. Now, if your ally doesn't agree, or for some reason you want to leave one army there, he could say, okay, I'll intercept with my 4 guys, you stay there with your 4 guys. And I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but there is no limit on the size of an army group. There's practical limits, but there's no forced limit. Let's say you don't have a leader. Sorry, Napoleon. You can still move. You can still place flags where you are. You can still fight battles. Your ability to intercept and evade is greatly restricted, or in case of interception, curtailed completely. Your battle odds are worse without the leader modifier. Your ability to move is limited to 4 formations. So these 5 without the leader couldn't move together like this. They could do this. There's one op. There's the second op. Now, as written in the second edition, it's not up to 4 formations move, it's 1 physical piece moves. There are only 1s, 2s, and 4s. This is not 1 physical piece, so it could not move 1 like that. It would have to go 1, 2. And I think the rationale is something like 1 is a brigade, 2 is a division, 4 is a corps, which were all sizes of units that would have a unified commander. But this number of men didn't really represent anything, and there would have to be 2 separate commanders dealing with that. In the third edition, I think that is going to change, and you'll just be able to move up to 4 pieces together, and that's how I'm just going to go ahead and start playing it. Now let's look at the navies. You've got a French and Spanish fleet in port here in Rotterdam, and the port symbols will tell you, Rotterdam is not a channel port because the port symbol is there. You do have a few places like Gibraltar. The port symbol's right on the dividing line between South Atlantic and Western Med. It's a port in both zones. Galicia here is another. It's a port on the Mid-Atlantic and the Bay of Biscay. Resummon my fleets here. And to mention as a side note that yes, this is correct. London, a port in real life, is not a port in the game. That was done on purpose because no enemy army would invade at London. You would presumably invade on the Channel coast and then move north. It also slows the British down in their overseas deployments. They have to be a little deliberate about it because in between turns you build in your capital. And since you're not building in a port as Britain, you can't immediately ship them out because convoy moves, which I haven't gotten into, have to go straight from port to port. Squadrons in this game. Britain has the best ones. They have by far the most of them. What I'm showing you here is not anything like what happens at start, where they have, I believe, 9 of them on the board and 1 of them building. They cost 4 command points to build. So as Britain, should I decide that I need to build a new squadron, I would spend 4 points, choose a port to build it in. Let's say Cornwall here because it's a 2-zone port. I flip it over to say it's in port, and I have to put this naval build on it, the 4 just meaning the 4 command points I spent. It is not actually a usable fleet for the entire rest of this turn. Then at the start of the next turn, the naval build marker goes away. I get a refit marker. Now it's a valid fleet. I have to spend a maneuver to remove it. A maneuver, by the way, is half a CP. Now it's just a regular fleet in port and I can use it. So squadrons are expensive. They are slow to build. Fleet battles tend to be decisive because it's so difficult to replace the losses compared to land units. The battle. And now for purposes of illustration, I'll add some extra fleets out here. As I said, maneuvers are half a command point. Moving from one sea area to another costs 1 maneuver. And again, the 3rd edition rules may be a little different on this. It's actually going to be a little simpler to move fleets that are, say, allied with each other. And for now, we'll assume it's just always half. So Britain could, for 1 command point, move this squadron into here and join that fleet, and then move this combined British-Danish fleet into the Bay of Biscay. That's 2 maneuvers, 1 command point. And now intercepting is a bit interesting because these are large sea areas compared to the land areas. So this French fleet here in the Bay of Biscay could intercept that move. They roll 2 dice trying to get a 9, but they're French, they're a +1 trying to get an 8. They probably wouldn't, since they'd have 2 dice to 8 dice. They'd probably just decline to do such a thing. The British can then try and intercept on offense. You only on defense do you intercept in land battles, but when you're fighting at sea, you can try and intercept to find an enemy who's in the zone with you, because if not, you just coexist in the zone and no one controls it. Intercepting in this fashion on your own turn, on your own impulse, when you are the active player, as I'm doing air quotes here and then realize those don't show up in this video, it's called patrolling. So to patrol, you would need a 9. This British fleet, let's say, now spins another maneuver, so they've now spent 1.5 command points. They spin a maneuver to patrol, they roll 2 dice. They get to add +2 because they're of the British, so they just need a 7. Then the French could try and evade. They also need a 9. They get a +1, so they really need an 8. If they evade, then nothing happens. If they fail to invade, then we fight a battle, and just like with land, the same things with 5 and 6s. The British get an extra dice for the French failed evasion. And another reason that naval combat tends to be decisive, these squadrons here are rolling 2 and 3 dice, unlike the land units that only roll 1 per unit. But each one of them is still killed by just a single 6, so the offense is greater than the defense for an individual squadron, because it doesn't matter how many 6s the British roll with their extra dice, each 6 still kills a squadron, which are very expensive to replace, and Britain tends to need lots of squadrons. Also worth noting, this modifier needs to be more than 50-50, since the British are +2, the Danish are +0, but there's more British, so they get that +2 modifier to their patrols. This British unit wasn't here. They don't get the modifier. They don't even average it and get a +1. They just get a +0, which is a 0. And then note these French squadrons here in port with the British out here, they are what is considered blockaded. So if they try and move out to go at sea, that means that this British-Danish fleet can try and intercept that move with a +1 bonus on top of their other modifiers, and the French could just accept that interception and fight. If the French then try and evade from that interception, rather than in other situations where you stay out, failing the evasion means you got to go back to that port when you came. Now you can still spend another maneuver and try again. Sometimes that's what you try and do as the French. You're not necessarily trying to win the battle. You're just trying to get out there. All right, they intercepted. I'll evade and go back. I'll spend another maneuver, another half a CP to try again. Hey, it worked this time. Now I'm out at sea. hey, Britain, you no longer control the sea area. Now you have to spend your own resources trying to track me down. Resources meaning your cards and command points, not necessarily meaning these resources. Why is it important to control the seas? Well, let's put a British formation here in York, and let's add Wellington. About time you get to see what Wellington is like here. The second best leader in the game, the only 4 besides Napoleon. He's a 6, not an 8, so he can't carry quite as big an army with him. This 1807 here just means the game turns are 2 years each, and Wellington can't, along with a couple other leaders, can't come into the game until 1807, so he's not available on the first turn. Let's say he wants to get on the continent. Now, if he were actually here in Kent, he could, because he's in a port, he can move port to port, which is called a convoy. Let's say also that the British control Antwerp here. Wellington could spend 2 points, 2 command points, one to move out into the channel, another to move into Antwerp, and there we go. Now he can't do that because there's an enemy squadron here. Also, if instead he wanted to do a little early D-Day and say invade in Normandy, he couldn't. He can move into Antwerp through this empty area because it's friendly. To invade where the enemy is, you have to have your own squadron or that of an ally. Now, a Wellington and 4, which is, by the way, the biggest force that can move by convoy, is 5 total formations. Could spend 2, 1 to move out to the channel, and then 1 to invade. Now, when you invade, you take 2 dice of shore battery fire, and then if there's an enemy force there that fights the battle, any losses you take from the shore batteries count in the battle. If you really want to amphibious invade a fort, you take 4 dice of shore battery. You also can't amphibiously invade where enemy fleets are. Your fleets would have to invade the enemy port, and they take the shore battery fire twice, once before the battle and once during the battle. So it's very hard to defeat enemies in port unless you bring a lot of firepower against them, or you have the fire ships event. So to quickly sum up, when moving a convoy through empty lands, you can only land on your own space. When invading an enemy, the rest of the sea zones can be empty, but the space you invade from has to be controlled by your side. You can never move through an enemy squadron. So in my previous example, where Wellington and his army were in York, if he wanted to invade into Rotterdam, he couldn't do it with this out here. Britain would have to eliminate or those squadrons there. Then Wellington could make his move into Rotterdam. It's worth noting here, because I didn't do it in the land battle section, though it's more relevant there, there are a lot of cards that can affect battle. Only actually a few of them affect naval battles. A card that doesn't specifically say naval battles only applies to land battles. There are 2 types of cards, and I wish I had a deck to show you here, but ones, they say response or battle on them, so it's pretty clear. A response card is just one you play out a turn. Most of them affect battles, but not all of them. You can play one to affect a battle whenever you want. If the card says battle event, you must have a formation in that battle to play it. You can't play a battle event for an ally without you having someone there. When multiple people want to play, and it's sort of a, do I want to play? It depends on if my enemy plays. Then here's what comes into play for that. You have to announce this in order of movement, which uses this track. France takes its impulse, then Britain. Let's say Britain, with Wellington as their 4, has landed in Antwerp, wants to attack this French force in Picardy, and you players are considering. This is called order of movement. It means Britain, then Austria, then Russia, etc. around, and France gets to decide to play last. If it were Russia's turn, Britain wouldn't be moving on Russia's turn. Russia has to decide first, so on, so on. Austria's last. That's order of movement. If anything ever says movement track order, that just means the order of this track, starting with France, ending with Denmark, no matter whose impulse it is. And that's as good a time as any to actually introduce how these impulses work. But first I wanted to show you, just so you can get a quick look, here are all the leaders in the game with better than a battle rating of 1. Notice almost half of them are French. There's a couple of Russians, 2 Brits, 2 Austrians, 1 Prussian, and 1 Swede. Notice event. Their specific event card has to be played to get this guy into the game. So to take an impulse, if you have a card, you may play it. Or you can take something called a plus action. Plus action is either to play one of your reserves, which are like the home cards from Here I Stand, but they are not cards, or a plus action is losing 1 resource to draw a card. So when it's your impulse, you can take a plus action, or you can play a card, or you can do both. You can't play 2 cards, and you can't take 2 plus actions. Now, sometimes you can end up playing multiple cards, because if you play an event, and then that event says to draw and play a card, there's not many of those, but then that all counts as part of that one card play. I believe there's only 1 or 2 ways to do that besides a couple of reserves that also let you do that. The number of cards you have is half the number of keys you have. But notice there's this French maximum hand here. These right here might be a little hard to read, maybe not, but there are minimums and maximum. The French will never draw more than 8 cards. They also will never draw less than 4. The other major powers always draw between 4 and 2, and the 4 minors always draw between 1 and 3. When there's extra cards, you can end up using them for diplomacy, or you may get a free resource out of them, but you won't actually get the extra cards. So you go through the impulses, France, Britain, Austria, go back around. When you're out of cards, you just get skipped, although you could still spend a resource to draw a card, and your forces can still siege, which I haven't really had time to get much into, but it's important to point out in this game, if you have an army attacking an enemy in a fort, enemies don't hide in forts. You have to siege the fort separately. You roll dice, the fort rolls dice equal to its number, but you have to roll 6s to count against the fort. The disrupts do nothing. There's more to it, but I'm breezing by it for the sake of time. It's important to mention, though, one of the easiest rules to forget in this game: if you are besieging an enemy port and the enemy controls the zone outside that port, then you lose 1 dice. So a common situation is the French or Spanish are besieging Lisbon. If there's a British squadron out in the South Atlantic, the besieging force loses a die. So you're going through the impulses. France tends to have more cards than other people. That's where this preempt comes in. The very first time through this track of the very first turn only, everyone must go in order. No one can change that. After that, whoever has the most cards, remember your reserves aren't cards, gets the preempt, which there's a counter you put above them. Technically, a lot of times you just count and remember. If you have preempt, then you can interrupt someone else before they play their card and say, hang on, I'm going to go ahead and take an extra impulse. You cannot use this to go twice in a row. So even if France has preempt after playing, Britain will go next. Unless someone else plays the one and only event card that is a special response card that says, I'm going to use this card to preempt right now. If you have that card and you really want to use it, which is actually rare, you need to speak up, because it would be silly for everyone to pause every single time and say, wait a second, is anyone playing Steal a March? But after Britain goes, France has the most cards, they can say, wait, Austria, you're not going, I'm going again. Then Austria could go. France still has the most cards. Wait, Russia, I'm going again. So France can really use their extra cards. Sometimes they use them for, hey, I've got more response cards, I'll just use them up on battle. Sometimes they use them to take multiple turns before one particular side can react. You don't just want to hold on to them all, because at the end of someone's impulse, if only one nation has cards remaining, that's it for the turn. So France has 2 cards, and Britain has 1. France plays 1, now they each have 1. Britain goes, plays 1. Now France has 1, no one else has any, turns over, and France just didn't get to play that last card. Although if they're short of their maximum hand size, it'll hold over till the next turn. And since reserves are not cards, you have to be careful, because if you wait too long to play your reserves, you can get caught without having a chance to play it. So let's look at those reserves that you have that you can play. France and Britain are the only one who has 2. This little void until start of next turn means you put a flag over them to show they're available, and then you pull the national flag off when you've played it, so then this reserve is void goes. So let's look really quick at what every side can do. Britain has a 6 CP card called Admiralty. If they control 6 zones, they get to draw 2 extra cards. If they don't control 6 zones, then they could just use this as the 6. That's one reason for Britain to spread out, but you got to be careful, because you could easily be defeated in detail that way. Notice this has a plus there. That means it's a plus action to use this. And remember, you can play a card from your hand, or take a plus action, or do both, and that's how you can get more than 6 CP in a turn. Remember how France would have had to spend 8 to build Napoleon. Britain could spend Admiralty, which is a 6, and another card,
or a card, not another, because reserves aren't cards, and get up to 12 CP in a given impulse. And then you can do quite a lot with 12. You've just deprived yourself of a lot all at once. Also, Parliament is a 5. They could play it for 5. If they know what's good for their team, they will usually use the event. They get to spend 1 point and then pick someone else, and that person gets to draw a card. Usually that's Austria, because Austria is getting overrun by France, or it's Prussia, because they're saying, hey, Prussia, join our side. I'll give you Parliament next turn. France has this Napoleon card, this striped blue here. That's the reserve card symbol, meaning it can be played out of turn. So if Napoleon's in a battle, after you see all the other dice, you can say, wait, Napoleon is committing the elite guards. They get 4 extra dice, and they're better than normal dice. They hit on a 6, disrupt on a 5, and they recover their own disrupted units on a 4. It's pretty common to use that. This one is really rare, but it's really fun when you see it used. If France has squadrons that aren't blockaded, which is tough for them to do, Britain tends to try and blockade them really fast, then they can move off board, and then if they're still off board at the end of the game, or sorry, at the end of the turn, Britain loses card draws. Britain has to move fleets off board to fight them. There's a whole little subsystem there. Britain can usually win that fight, but France can only move 2 squadrons off board. Well, so can Britain. So the fight is 6-4 there, which the French can win that one. And if you wait till the end of the turn, Britain doesn't have much in the way of cards or reserve left. They may not be able to spend the CP to fight you off board, and then they'll just lose cards. You also lose 6 CP in a reserve, so it's tough to deal with. But every now and then it happens, and it's quite interesting when it does. Austria has what I think is one of the weaker ones. It's also a response. It can be played out of turn. It blocks anyone from placing flags in Austria. Austria always succeeds when intercepting or evading battle until their next play. The problem is you lose the 6 points, and if France is invading Austria and placing flags, and you try and stop them with this, that generally just delays the inevitable, and now you have 6 fewer CP to try and stop it from becoming inevitable. Generally, I'd rather use that 6 CP to, say, build 3 combat units. However, if they're about to flag your capital, that can be really useful. Normally, even when your capital is fallen, it's not until the end of the turn that you might surrender, but there is one and only one event that can cause you to capitulate mid-turn and force you to, in fact, if your capital is under enemy control. Russia, one of the versatile one. If Russia is not involved in a foreign war, that part's easy to forget, there's events that make you fight enemies off board. And if no enemies are in the Russian home duchies, they can draw 2 cards and play one of them. Interestingly, it doesn't come into effect if someone's invading Russia, which you would think, well, wait, that's backwards. I think this card is sort of Russia looking to the long term with their economy, and if someone's in there, in Russia, you just got to use it for that 6 CP right away. It also means there's some reason to invade Russia. Russia's tough to invade. They have 2 capitals. There's lots of space. There are a couple of Russian winter or heavy attrition cards. France doesn't get their normal benefit of having only half attrition losses. But at least if you get into Russia, they can't draw 2 cards. Notice you must, it's not may, you must play one of those 2 you drew. That's all part of this Plux action and doesn't count as a card play, which is sometimes good for you, but sometimes you'd rather hold both cards. Or you can roll a die, and if you roll less than the current turn it is, you just get a free resource. So on turns maybe 3, definitely if the game gets to 4 and 5, Russia might be wanting to do that, because even if you fail, you at least get some units out of it. But on the first couple of turns, you're usually drawing this, because if it's on turn 1, you can't roll less than the turn number. If it's on turn 2, you have to roll a 1 to gain a resource. Otherwise, you're building units that you may roll a 2 or 3 and build 2 or 3 units. Well, for 6 CP, you could build 3 units anyway. Then Prussia has a reserve that can't be used on turn 1, but after that, they can place 3 units plus a leader in their home duchy, which normally just the 3 units would cost 6. So they can build up their forces a little bit faster. Moving on to the minors. Oops, that one is backwards. Notice their reserves here are not plus actions. Spain can roll a die to draw 1 or 2 cards.
If they're only drawing 1, it's probably going to be worse than a 5 because the cards are 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, approximately equal numbers of each. But you have to subtract the number of enemy forces, which are in Spain, anywhere down here, or these 3 British duchies there. So if Britain can hold on to these and keep forces there, or invade Spanish territory, or even the island of Majorca there, then they can reduce the odds that the Spanish home card will be useful. The Turks can forfeit some CPs to make their units not unable to be disrupted in a battle, or they can just get 1 CP plus a card draw. Spain, instead of playing it for the 5, could get 3 and ignore disruptions only if they're fighting in Sweden. Denmark has a confusing one that will be simplified for 3rd edition, but their fleets get bonuses in fighting, and they can take 4 maneuvers out of turn. They get to ignore 1 enemy kill in battle, which is really useful. Sometimes you'll see them play that in the middle of the British impulse, so the British go in and fight with a large British fleet plus a couple of Danes. Then the Danes play this, got the blue stripes, it's a response. Danes play it out of turn, and now the first French 6. Oh, I'll apply that to the Danes. Oh, the Danes get to ignore that one. So these minors, as I'm quickly running out of time. How do you get them on your side? Well, Spain actually starts on the French side, but nobody else starts all the way in someone's pact, and you have to be in their pact to control their forces. You don't get points, by the way, for anything their forces take over, but they can deprive the enemy of points, or they can just be your bullet catchers is common. You spend CP to move them up on your track. So Russia, this unaligned is anyone. So Russia could spend 2 to move the Turks up to here, or 4 to move them here, or 8 here, or 13 here. And remember, the most you can get is 12 with a 6 CP reserve and a 6 CP card. So without an event card that gives you a bonus, you couldn't jump all the way. If they're here, this unaligned is all one column, so the Austrians could move them up too. Once they're here, someone else would have to move them back. Notice there's a 2 up here. It's 2 to move back. If they're here, it's 2 to move them back to here, 2 more to move them here. Notice this is uneven. Russia could spend 4 to move the Turks to here, but then one of Russia's presumably enemies, or a friend who thinks they're about to win and needs to stop them, could only spend 2 to backtrack to here. You can only spend CP to move up on your own column. So Britain can't say, hey, Russia, I'll spend 4 to help move the Turks up. You can always spend to move anyone backwards. It helps there that France already has Spain. So you've got Swedes here, which for 5 could become a British pact, but France could spend 2 of the Spanish CP to move them back here. By the way, just like there's no preempting your very first time through this track on the very first turn, there's no diplomatic play until it gets back around to France again on the very first time through the track. However, once someone is in pact, let's say you don't spin that, and Britain on their turn says, yeah, I'll spend 5, pact the Swedes. They get a VP, they get control of the Swedish forces and the Swedish cards. Now you cannot spend 4 to move them back. They can only be broken by an event that specifically says this will break the pact, although there is one event that doesn't say that. It just says move it to unaligned, and they mean move it there no matter what. But if an event just says spend some points on the track or move someone 1 box, you can't break the pact if it doesn't say break the pact. There are only 3 or 4 events that do that. And when these minors aren't in anyone's control, which 3 of the 4 aren't at the start of the game, when it's their impulse, gets here to Turkey, the Turks are not controlled by anyone, you just flip a card from the Turkish hand and play it, and they generally just build up and do nothing other than build forces. But there are some events which have a different coloring in the corner. If it's green or red, the neutral side may actually play that as the event. It's kind of an event randomizer. Sometimes things happen like, oh, look, the Anglo-American War, the War of 1812 is happening. Britain has to move these guys off board to fight the U.S. Or, oh, look, Russia just mobilized some forces. Great, or not great, depending on which side you are. At the end of the turn, when everyone has played all their cards, or when one side is stuck holding some cards, then there's a 1 in 6 chance the game might just end. So you have to play every turn like it's the last. So we finish turn 1, we're halfway to turn 2. There's some cleanup that happens if you're in an uncontrolled space, meaning your forces are in the enemy, remember, but you haven't flagged it yet. You take attrition, but then you do get to flag it. The naval builds happen. And then you roll a die, and if it's a 6, the game ends. Well, that seems a little random, so you can use your future resources to affect that. Let's say Britain into the impulse. Austria then would have the first chance to say, I will draw one fewer card less next turn to make it so that instead of a 6 ends the game, a 7 will end the game, which can't happen. And then Russia says, no, I won't do that. Then Prussia says, no, I won't do that. No one else, the minors, can't do it. France is winning, says, I'll spend a resource. I'll lose a card next turn. I'll burn a card to turn it back down to a 6. Britain goes last, so they think, boy, do I want there to be a 1 in 6 chance of France just winning the game and it being over, or do I want to spend a card also? Let's say Britain spins, it's back to 7, you don't roll, game moves on to turn 2, with France, Britain, and Austria now all drawing one fewer card. Remember, there's minimum draws of 4 for France, 2 for everyone else. If your enemy is at 2, or 4 in France's case, they can't forfeit a draw because they can't forfeit below minimum. So France, who's usually winning during the first couple of turns, wants to at least try and knock an enemy or two down to that point so their enemies can't spin the cards because France really wants to get that roll. There are only 3, I believe, events that modify it. One gives a +1 to the game not ending, one gives a 1 or 2 towards the game ending, and one makes the game likely to end with a modifier equal to the turn number called Europe exhausted. So once it gets to 3 or 4, if that card comes out, oh, it's turn 4? Well, now we're adding 4 to the die roll, so now the game will end on a 2+ instead of a 6+. And the side who has that card has to play it, but only they know they have it until they play it, which can give them some advantage. It is usually, in my opinion, worth it to spend the die roll to keep the game going. That 1 in 6, 2 in 6 chance of losing, if you let France, who again generally wins early, have that roll several times, they're going to get it at some point usually. Then there's a chance to switch sides, which remember France and Britain can't do, or join sides if you are Prussia. France is easily as powerful as any 2 countries, maybe 3, probably not all 4. So if Prussia eventually joins the coalition against the Imperials, France can win a 5-turn game like that. Hats off to them. Usually won't happen, since only one nation can win the game in the end, as everyone starts eating away at France if the game gets to that point. At some point, whoever's getting the short end of the straw is going to say, you know what, France, I think I'll join you. And then things can get really interesting because suddenly you're with the side that you weren't. Now Austria or Prussia have Russia attacking them from the rear, for example, or suddenly the French forces got Prussia to join them, and now they can deploy, all the way over here. Deployments, yes, that's probably about the last thing I'll get to. I'm close to the end. In between turns, you get free builds in your capital. There's a different number per side. France gets 18. Austria, Russia, and Prussia get 8. Britain only gets 6. The minors get 4 or 2. And then you can make a free deployment across zones you or your allies control. Also, if let's say France knocks Austria out, France can deploy through Austria while Austria is forced to be neutral for a turn, but the other side can't move in. So France could deploy a large army with Napoleon in it out here to Lublin and threaten Russia, or spend 7 CP to declare war on Prussia mid-turn, which is rare because it costs 7, but you could do it. And then, surprise attack. Oh, I control Warsaw here. Oh, it's my associate. Now I can build forces here in Warsaw. That's a rare move, but can happen. Knocking people out of the game is difficult but possible. And again, they're neutral for a turn, and you can deploy through their territory. It's also a way to get automatic victory. As France, if you've knocked the British or Russians out for the turn and you have over 6 VP, the game will just end automatically. It doesn't mean you win. It means the game ends. So you could have 6 CP victory points and someone else could have 8. That's unlikely if you have knocked Britain or Russia out for a turn. And then if France capitulates like that, the game just is over. It doesn't matter how many victory points anyone has, and it just whoever has the most wins, which again still theoretically could be France, but I doubt that would ever happen. Might not even be possible. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not, since once you get knocked out, you lose all your resources. So France getting knocked out would have negative victory points. You get knocked out when your capital is controlled, and you can surrender voluntarily or roll a die. You roll the die, you need to get a 6 to knock them out, but you get to add 1 for each key you control, and there's a modifier. Some sides are harder. France, Spain, and the Turks are -2, so they're harder to knock out. Sweden and Denmark are easier to knock out, mostly because they don't have that many keys. So otherwise, it would be really hard to roll because you'd have to be getting a 6 or 5. But actually, if you control every single key they have, which is these 3 here in Sweden's case, they would automatically surrender. If you control 2 of them, you get a +2, but then you also get Sweden's +2 modifier here. So anyway, between the turns, everyone builds, everyone deploys. You do it in movement track order. So here, Britain ended the turn, let's say. That meant Austria had to burn a card first. Austria has to build and deploy first, then see what France does. After you've drawn your cards, you get a chance to mulligan, which means discard them all and then draw 1 fewer. It's pretty rare, but if you have all 2s and 3s, could be worth it. Also, 3rd edition change, because the odd thing is a little weird. Odd numbers of keys. Let me move these to the side so it's a little easier to see the numbers. Like Russia has 7, so they'll draw 3 because it's 1 for every 2. Well, that was a little weird because it meant Russia could lose 1 key, so what? They still draw 3 cards. So it's turn 2 here. Russia has neither gained nor lost. They roll a die on a 4, 5, 6. It's like they had 6. If they on a 4, 5, or 6, it's like they had 8 and they draw 4. On a 1, 2, or 3, it's like they had 6. So there's now reason to fight for every key instead of only fighting for the even ones but being willing to lose the odd. Again, not in the current rules as written, but will be a change for the 3rd edition. There are about 100 cards in the deck. 30 to 40 will probably be seen every turn. So if the game goes 4 or 5 turns, you'll probably see just about every card once, but not a guarantee. A lot of cards will come out twice, but there's less than a 50-50 chance of seeing a card really on a given turn. I'm a little over the hour now, and there's a lot of little things I didn't get to, but I think this covers just about all the fundamental rules of the game and a few other little bits and pieces of modifiers here. I didn't want to just narrate every chart, obviously, or this will only happen once in 100 games. This game has a lot of events compared to most games that just rarely get played, and a few events that are really powerful. There's